My aunt kicked me out for not giving her enough money, so I left and within a year made her regret. I never asked for much out of life. Just a roof, maybe some genuine conversation, and food that doesn't come from the clearance aisle. But at 18, I discovered how quickly even the basics can slip through your fingers. My name's Jacob. Home is a beat-up trailer on the outskirts of town, the kind with peeling paint and a for sale sign that's been hanging so long it's practically a permanent fixture. The sign so faded you can barely make out the phone number anymore. Not that anyone's calling. This place has been slowly sinking into the dirt since before I was born. Every evening, like clockwork, the neighbors fire up their lawnmowers. The constant humming becomes this weird soundtrack to my life, mixing with Johnny Cash's gravelly voice crackling through my ancient radio. Cash sings about prisons while I'm trapped in my own. Different bars, same feeling. I work as a cashier at the local supermarket. 8 hours a day under flickering fluorescent lights, scanning groceries for people who barely look at me. The place smells like dust and yesterday's bread, but it's a paycheck. Not much of one, but it keeps me fed. My mom took off 3 months ago with her new boyfriend, some guy named Rick with a motorcycle, and promises of seeing the Grand Canyon. Left me a note on the fridge. Staying with Rick for a while. Aunt Deb will check on you. That was it. 18 years of raising me. Summarized in a sentence scribbled on the back of an electric bill. As for my dad, he's just a blank space in my memory. Sometimes I think I remember his laugh or the smell of his aftershave, but then I realize I'm probably just making it up from old photographs. Now it's just me and Aunt Deb in the trailer. She moved in after Mom left, bringing cigarette smoke and resentment with her. She's tall, rail-thin, with dyed red hair and eyes that cut through you like she's constantly calculating what you're costing her. Last night, she cornered me when I got home from my shift, standing in our cramped kitchen, arms crossed, tapping her foot against the linoleum floor. She told me flat out that what I contribute is enough, that the bills are piling up, and my paycheck doesn't cover half of what it should. Her exact words still ring in my ears. You're good, Jacob, but goodness won't buy me a new television. I tried explaining that I'm already giving her everything I make, that after taxes, my minimum wage job barely clears $1,100 a month. I showed her my last pay stub as proof. That's when something in her snapped. Her face twisted into something ugly, something that reminded me too much of Mom when she'd been drinking. She started screaming about how I was useless, just like my father, how taking me in was the biggest mistake of her life. Before I could even defend myself, she stormed into my room, the closet-sized space where I keep the few things that are actually mine. She grabbed the shoebox from under my bed, the one with all the photos I have of my parents from when things were better. Pictures of birthdays, Christmas mornings, fishing trips. The only proof I have that we were once happy. I followed her outside as rain started coming down hard. Without hesitation, she tossed the entire box into the trash can by the curb. Photos scattered into the garbage, getting soaked by rainwater as they landed among coffee grounds and empty TV dinner trays. Her words cut deep in the cold rain, soaking through my uniform shirt. Get out! You're nobody's problem anymore. You're not needed, not by me, not by the world. The trailer door slammed behind her, leaving me standing in the downpour, staring at my memories dissolving in the rain. I fished out as many photos as I could, but most were already ruined, faces blurring into watercolor versions of themselves. My hands were shaking as I salvaged what little I could. With nowhere else to go, I walked 3 miles to the Starlight Motel, that run-down place by the interstate with the cracked neon sign, where only half the letters still light up. $29 a night for a room that smelled like cigarettes and broken dreams. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I spread out the wet photos on the faded comforter, hoping some might dry okay. Most were beyond saving, but one survived almost intact. A Polaroid of my grandmother standing in front of her small cafe, flour dust in her apron, a tray of cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter behind her. That photo was like finding water in a desert. Grandma Ruby was the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered. Before she passed when I was 9, I'd spend weekends at her cafe, watching her turn flour and sugar into magic while customers treated her like family. The memory of that place, the warmth, the smell of cinnamon, the way she remembered everyone's name, suddenly felt like more than a memory. It felt like a blueprint. As Johnny Cash sang softly from the motel radio about walking the line, I made myself a promise, not a vague hope or a desperate wish, but an actual promise. I'll prove to myself and everyone else that I can rise from nothing. I looked around the dingy motel room, at my soaked clothes hanging over the shower rod, at the $153 on the nightstand next to the damp Polaroid. Just enough saved from my last paycheck to cover the motel and some food until next payday. But not much to build a future on. But something my grandmother once told me came floating back. Family isn't who breathes beside you. It's who doesn't throw your heart in the trash. That night, as trucks rumbled by on the interstate, I fell asleep with a strange mix of anger and determination burning in my chest. In my mind, I could almost smell those cinnamon rolls from my childhood. The sweetness, the warmth, the feeling of belonging. A crazy idea started taking shape in my dreams. What if I could create a place like my grandmother's cafe? A small corner of the world where people felt welcomed, where the coffee was hot, and the pastries made you close your eyes with that first bite. But reality has a way of crashing through dreams. I had exactly $3 to my name and a damp Polaroid with my grandmother's smile. Not exactly startup capital for a cafe. Still, as I drifted between sleep and wakefulness, that image wouldn't leave me. A little cafe with my name on the sign, cinnamon rolls in the display case, and people who came in strangers but left as friends. $153, one photograph, and an impossible dream. Barely enough to survive until my next paycheck. But something told me it might be just enough to get started. 1 week into my new life at the Starlight Motel, and I was learning the hard way that independence costs more than advertised. The $153 had dwindled fast between motel fees, bus fare to work, and those gas station sandwiches that taste like disappointment wrapped in plastic. But I had a roof, a job, and no one telling me I was worthless. It was something. My routine became predictable. Wake up, catch the 6:15 bus, stand at register number 7 for 8 hours scanning groceries, catch the 5:40 bus back, eat something questionable, sleep, repeat. The kind of existence that makes you understand why older folks stare into the middle distance with that 1,000-yard gaze. Value Mart wasn't exactly a career destination, but it paid $11.50 an hour, and the manager didn't ask questions when I changed my address to a motel. Most of my coworkers were either high school kids, saving for cars, or retirees supplementing Social Security. I existed somewhere in between. Too old for prom, too young for ARP, stuck in that weird American purgatory being technically adult, but practically clueless. It was a Tuesday evening, about 10 minutes before closing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were telling secrets only they understood. The store was empty except for me and Darlene, the night manager who spent most of her shift doing crossword puzzles and talking about her cats. The automatic doors whooshed open, letting in a blast of October air and an elderly woman I hadn't seen before. She was small, the kind of small that happens when life slowly compresses you over decades. Her coat had probably been fashionable sometime during the Nixon administration, worn but meticulously clean. What caught my eye was her canvas shopping bag, with faded American flag carefully embroidered on the side. She moved slowly through the aisles, checking prices with careful deliberation. When she finally approached my register, she placed her items down gently, a small bag of store-brand rice, a can of tuna, and a tin of the cheapest coffee Value Mart carried. The total came to $7.86. She opened a worn leather wallet and carefully counted out exact change, then handed me a coupon, one of those $2 off your purchase deals that corporate sent out to get people through the door. It was so faded I could barely scan it, but eventually the register beeped its approval, bringing her total down to $5.86. Her face fell as she recounted the money in her palm, $4.87, 89 cents short. She looked at the coffee, then back at her money, calculations happening behind eyes that had seen more American history than my high school textbook. With a resigned sigh that felt heavier than it should have, she pushed the coffee tin aside. "Just these two, then," she said, her voice soft but clear, with that particular Midwest accent that turns every sentence into a gentle melody. I can do without the coffee. Watching her carefully return the tin to her canvas bag, I felt something twist in my chest. For the past 2 weeks, I've been so wrapped up in my own drama. Poor Jacob, kicked out, abandoned, misunderstood. But here was someone who couldn't spare $1 for coffee, yet didn't complain or make a scene. Just quiet dignity and a soft, I can do without. Without really thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, part of my bus fare for tomorrow. I'd have to walk an extra mile, but my legs worked fine. I'll add the difference, I said quietly, smoothing out the dollar on the counter. My grandmother always said, if you can make someone's day easier, you should. Her eyes widened slightly, then filled with tears so suddenly it was as if I'd said something tragic instead of just offering $1. Young man, she started, then stopped, clearly fighting to maintain composure. I'm not used to people noticing. I bag her groceries as slowly as possible, giving her time to collect herself. Darlene looked up from her crossword, raised an eyebrow, then went back to 7 across without comment. The woman thanked me again with a gentleness that made me embarrassed for every time I complained about my life. As she turned to leave, she suddenly swayed, her hand flying to her chest. The canvas bag slipped from her grasp, the tin of coffee rolling across the linoleum floor like a slow-motion scene in a movie. I vaulted over the counter in a move that would have got me fired if the manager had been there, catching her elbow just as her knees started to buckle. I'll be fine, she insisted, though her face had gone the color of paste and her breathing was shallow. Just need to sit a moment. Darlene was suddenly beside us, surprisingly quick for someone who'd spent most of the evening stationary. Together, we helped the woman to the bench outside the store entrance, where the cool evening air seemed to revive her somewhat. Her color returned gradually as she took deep, measured breaths. Margaret, she introduced herself with a weak smile. Margaret Wilson. Just overtired, Margaret insisted, though the way her hand rested on her heart suggested otherwise. Been a long day. Haven't eaten since breakfast. Darlene shot me a look. Jacob, there's a vending machine in the break room. Get her something with sugar. By the time I returned with a candy bar and a bottle of water, Margaret was looking steadier. She accepted both with thanks that felt disproportionate to the offering, as she carefully unwrapped the chocolate, breaking it into small, precise pieces as if rationing it. She studied me with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Thank you, she said. I don't usually get lightheaded like that. Must have been standing up too quickly. You're new here, she stated rather than asked after a few bites. Living at the Starlight, aren't you? I see you waiting for the bus. I nodded, surprised she'd noticed me at all. Thought so. You have that look. When I raised an eyebrow, she clarified, like you're figuring things out on your own for the first time. I remember that look. Had it myself once. As Darlene returned to her crossword inside, Margaret began talking. Slowly at first, then with increasing animation as the sugar hit her system. Her voice had that quality older folks sometimes get when they've been quiet too long, like they're remembering how conversation works. She'd been born in this town, left for a while, then returned with her husband in the early 60s when he came back from Korea. They'd opened a small cafe on Cherry Street, the kind with chrome counter, vinyl booze, and a genuine Wurlitzer jukebox that played Elvis and Buddy Holly. Rosie's, she said, with such tenderness you'd think she was naming a child. After my mother, we had the best milkshakes in 3 counties. Real ice cream, not that soft-serve nonsense. People would drive 30 miles just for our Sunday breakfast. For the next 20 minutes, I sat on that bench learning the history of Rosie's Cafe, how it became the unofficial community center of our small town, hosting everything from first dates to funeral gatherings. How Margaret's husband, Earl, knew every customer by name and would slip free coffee to truckers who looked tired. How their cherry pie recipe won blue ribbons at the county fair 3 years running. Then her voice changed, grew heavier, as she described Earl's cancer diagnosis in '98, how the medical bills piled up faster than autumn leaves, how she kept the cafe running alone after he passed, but the heart went out of place without him. The final blow came from her own children. Twin sons who lived on the West Coast with successful careers and strong opinions about their mother's financial choices. They wanted me to sell, she said, picking at a loose thread on her coat sleeve. Said I was being foolish, that the property was worth good money to developers. We had the worst fight of our lives. 10 years ago now, and we've barely spoken since. They send Christmas cards with pictures of grandchildren I've never met. She hadn't sold, but she couldn't keep it going either. For the past decade, Rosie's had stood empty, locked but maintained, a time capsule of vinyl and chrome gathering dust while Margaret lived on her meager Social Security in a small apartment across town. The funny thing is, she added with a sad smile, I don't even go inside anymore. Just drive by sometimes, make sure the roof isn't leaking. It's silly to hold on to it, I know, but it feels like the last piece of Earl I have left. As she spoke, something stirred in my memory, a faded for lease sign in a window downtown, large red letters spelling Rosie's above the door. I'd passed it dozens of times without really seeing it, the way you stop noticing landmarks in your own town. Why are you telling me all this? I asked when she finally fell silent. It wasn't rude, just genuine confusion. We were strangers connected by nothing more than $1 and a moment of kindness. Margaret studied me for a long moment, her eyes suddenly sharp and assessing. Because you remind me of Earl, she said finally. Same kind of quiet decency. And because I'm getting old. And when you get old, you start to wonder what happens to things you loved after you're gone. She reached into her canvas bag and withdrew something that glinted in the fluorescent light. An old-fashioned key attached to a tarnished silver keychain shaped like a coffee cup. I want you to have this, she said, holding it out with fingers that trembled slightly. It's the key to Rosie's. I've been carrying it around for weeks now, looking for something. Maybe it was you. I stare at the key, not reaching for it. Certain there must be some misunderstanding. Mrs. I realized I didn't even know her last name. Margaret will do just fine, she interrupted gently. Margaret, I can't take your cafe. That's crazy. I'm 18. I don't know the first thing about running a business. She laughed then, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to shed years from her face. I'm not giving you the deed, young man. Just the key. The place is still mine. But it needs someone with energy and vision to bring it back to life. Someone who understands that a good cafe isn't about fancy espresso machines. It's about making people feel like they belong somewhere. She pressed the key into my palm, closing my fingers around it with surprising strength. Take a look around. See if it speaks to you. If it doesn't, bring the key back and no harm done. But if it does... Her eyes brightened with something that looked suspiciously like hope. All I ask is that you don't turn it into something soulless, and that you don't sell it. It's my piece of youth, you understand? My last connection to the man I loved. I held the key like it might burn me, equal parts terrified and electrified by its weight in my hand. This had to be some kind of fever dream brought on by too many microwave burritos and late shifts. Why me? I asked, still unable to process what was happening. You don't even know me. Margaret stood carefully, gathering her canvas bag and groceries. Her voice, when she answered, carried the certainty of someone who has lived long enough to trust their instincts. Because you gave your last $1 to a stranger for a can of coffee. In my experience, that tells me more about a person than a resume ever could. She turned to leave, then paused, adding over her shoulder, sometimes $1 isn't just paper. Sometimes it's a ticket to someone else's dream. Before she left, Margaret turned back to me. Meet me tomorrow morning at Rosie's. 8 o'clock sharp. I'll show you around the place, tell you everything you need to know. She smiled gently. No obligations. Just come see what you think. I watched her walk slowly toward the bus stop, her small figure gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. The key felt impossibly heavy in my palm. Not physically, but with the weight of possibility. Later that night, I lay on my motel bed, holding the key up to the light filtering through the thin curtains. It was old, the kind they don't make anymore, solid brass with an ornate head and teeth worn smooth from decades of use. The coffee cup keychain had Rosie's, "We're everybody's family," engraved on the back in tiny letters. I turned it over and over, wondering if I was being handed an opportunity or a burden. What would I even do with an abandoned cafe? The sum total of my culinary expertise was microwaving ramen noodles without the soup exploding. But as I closed my eyes, images began forming in my mind. Sunlight streaming through freshly cleaned windows, the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls, people talking and laughing at chrome-edged tables. And standing behind the counter, confident and proud, was me? The key rested on my chest as I drifted toward sleep, its weight both terrifying and comforting. It felt like holding a piece of the past and a doorway to the future simultaneously, like an artifact from some cheesy 80s movie about time travel and second chances. Oh, tarnished, but somehow full of possibility. A small metal promise that tomorrow might be different from today. And for the first time since leaving the trailer, I fell asleep without the gnawing anxiety of uncertainty. Instead, my dreams were filled with jukebox music and the lingering question, what if? I barely slept that night, turning the key over my hand until the first hints of dawn crept through the cheap motel curtains. By 7:30, I was already standing outside Rosie's Cafe on Cherry Street, half an hour early for my meeting with Margaret. The building sat between a hardware store and what used to be a video rental place, its faded red awning drooping slightly in the middle like a tired smile. The windows were clouded with years of dust, but I could make out vague shapes of counter stools and booths inside. The sign above the door, Rosie's an elegant cursive that must have been beautiful when it still lit up, gave the place a ghostly dignity, like an old movie star who'd aged but never lost her poise. Margaret arrived precisely at 8, wearing the same coat but a different scarf, this one hand knitted in red, white, and blue. The American flag theme seemed to be her signature. Her eyes crinkled with approval when she saw me waiting. She fumbled in her purse for her own set of keys, but I held up the one she'd given me the night before. This seemed to please her immensely. There was something ceremonial about using that key for the first time, like I was opening more than just a door. The lock was stiff from disuse, requiring a bit of jiggling before it finally gave way with a satisfying click. The door creaked open like it was speaking to us after a decade of silence. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not musty or moldy as I'd expected, but a complex bouquet of old coffee, cinnamon, and something else I couldn't name but recognized instantly. It smelled exactly like my grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. That impossible coincidence nearly took my knees out from under me. Margaret flipped a switch, and against all odds, a few of the overhead lights flickered to life, revealing the interior in a soft, amber glow. Time had frozen here sometime around 1975. Red vinyl booths lined one wall, their seats cracked in places but still intact. A long chrome counter ran along the opposite side, with round stools bolted to the floor at regular intervals. Behind it stood an ancient coffee machine and a glass display case that once held pies and pastries. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but underneath, you could see the bones of something special. In the back corner stood the jukebox, a genuine Wurlitzer that gleamed even through the grime. Margaret approached it with reverence, running her fingers along its curved top. With a mischievous smile that took years off her face, she reached into her purse and pulled out a quarter. Before I could tell her it probably wouldn't work after all these years, she dropped the coin into the slot with practiced ease. There was a mechanical whirring. Then the unmistakable opening notes of Frank Sinatra's My Way crackled through speakers that had been silent for a decade. The music filled the empty cafe like water filling a dry riverbed, bringing life back to something that had been dormant but never truly dead. Margaret closed her eyes, swaying slightly to melody, lost in memories I could only imagine. I wandered around in a daze, taking in details that told the story of what this place had once been. Faded Coca-Cola posters from the 70s hung on the walls. Red and white checkered tablecloths, stained but still bright in patches, covered the tables. Behind the counter, a pegboard still held handwritten prices for items that sounded like they were from another planet. Egg cream, 75 cents. Blue plate special, $3.25. Coffee bottomless cup, 50 cents. It wasn't just a cafe. It was a time capsule. As Sinatra sang about facing the final curtain, I felt something wet on my cheeks and realized with embarrassment that I was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears tracking through the dust on my face. Something about this place reached past all my defenses and touched a part of me I didn't know was there. Margaret pretended not to notice, giving me the dignity of my unexpected emotion. She busied herself wiping dust from the counter with a handkerchief she pulled from her pocket. Eventually, she broke the silence. Her voice was soft but clear above the music as she told me that her husband had built most of the furniture himself, how he'd insisted on real maple for the counter and spent weeks getting the finish just right, how he'd drive 3 towns over to get the best beans of their coffee because he believed details mattered. The jukebox finished Sinatra and, without missing a beat, shifted to Elvis Presley's Can't Help Falling in Love. The mechanical arm selecting and placing the record was visible through the glass front, a beautiful dance of gears and precision. Margaret smiled gently at my obvious fascination with the place. She told me that her husband always said America was special because it was the only place where anyone could build their own little world if they had enough heart and hustle. She believed I could bring this place back to life. I should have told her she was crazy, that I was 18 with no money, no experience, and no business trying to revive a cafe that had been closed longer than I'd been alive. That this whole thing was a bizarre fever dream I'd stumbled into after being kicked out of the only home I'd ever known. Instead, I found myself asking practical questions about the plumbing, the electrical system, the equipment in the kitchen. Margaret answered everything with surprising detail. The place had been closed but not abandoned. She maintained the essentials, paid the minimal utilities to prevent freezing pipes, even had an exterminator come quarterly. It was as if she'd been preserving it, waiting for something or someone. We spent the morning going through every inch of the cafe, cataloging what needed to be replaced, what could be salvaged, what was still miraculously in working order. The vintage refrigerator hummed to life when plugged in. The ancient espresso machine looked like it belonged in a steampunk novel, but apparently just needed descaling. Even the griddle, after some coaxing and cleaning, heated evenly across its broad surface. My head was spinning with possibilities and problems in equal measure. The place had good bones, but bringing it back would require money I didn't have. When I mentioned this, Margaret just nodded and said we should discuss the business side of things. She led me to a booth in the corner, clearly her favorite, judging by how she automatically slid into one side, and pulled out a manila folder from her large purse. What happened next still feels like something from a movie. Margaret called her attorney from an actual flip phone, put him on speaker as she explained that she wanted to transfer the cafe to me. Not as a gift. She was clear about that, but as a long-term lease with an option to buy, with terms that made my head spin with their generosity. I would pay nothing for the first 6 months while I got the place up and running. After that, a modest monthly amount that was less than half what commercial rent would normally be. All equipment came with the space. She even had recipes, hundreds of them, handwritten on index cards and stored in metal boxes, the collective wisdom of decades in the kitchen. Her lawyer sounded concerned, asking repeatedly if she was sure about this arrangement. Margaret's response was simple. Earl would approve. By noon, I had signed papers I barely understood, becoming the official operator of cafe I had no idea how to run. Margaret beamed like she just solved a particularly troubling problem. On paper, she was still the owner, but Rosie's was now my responsibility. As reality sank in, panic began to rise in my chest. What I just agreed to. I had about $73 to my name. No credit, no collateral. And now I was supposed to resurrect a business that had been dead for a decade? Margaret must have seen the fear on my face. She reached across the table and patted my hand with surprising firmness. She reminded me that every great American success story started with someone crazy enough to try something impossible. Then she handed me one last thing, a small leather-bound book that turned out to be a business account at First National with $5,000 earmarked for Rosie's renovation. When I protested, she simply said it was the money she'd been saving to fix the place up herself, but her knees weren't what they used to be. Better it should go to someone with youth and energy. We parted ways around 1 o'clock, with Margaret heading home for her afternoon rest and me standing alone in a cafe that was somehow now mine to revive. The silence after she left was profound. Just me, dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through dirty windows, and the ghosts of countless conversations that had happened in these booths. I walked slowly around the space again, trying to see not what it was, but what it could be. In my mind's eye, I started clearing away the dust, replacing cracked vinyl, polishing the chrome until it gleamed. I imagined the smell of fresh coffee and baking pastries, the sound of conversations and laughter, the clink of forks against plates. For the first time since being thrown out of the trailer, I felt something like purpose taking root inside me. That evening, back in my motel room, I made what might have been the craziest decision yet in a day full of them. I pulled out my phone, a 3-year-old model with a cracked screen, but the camera still worked, and recorded a video of myself sitting on the edge of the bed. I talked simply and directly about being kicked out, about meeting Margaret, about the cafe frozen in time. I showed the key, explaining how a random act of kindness had somehow led to this impossible opportunity. I panned around my sad motel room, then showed glimpses of the cafe I'd captured earlier. The contrast was stark. My current nowhere existence versus this place that felt like it had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. I ended by asking a simple question. Should I try to save this place? With shaking hands, I uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "Homeless at 18, just got offered a time capsule diner. Worth saving." I had maybe 40 followers, mostly from high school. I expected nothing. I woke the next morning to my phone vibrating itself off the nightstand. Bleary-eyed and confused, I grabbed it to find thousands of notifications flooding in. The video had exploded overnight, racking up over 10,000 likes and climbing. The comments section was chaos. "This is the most American thing ever. Small-town diner comeback story. That jukebox alone is worth saving. I drive hours for a real 60s diner experience. My grandparents had their first date in a place just like this. Gen Z saving boomer treasures is the crossover we needed. Most surprisingly, people were asking how they could help. Some offered skills, a retired electrician, a plumber looking for side work, a graphic designer willing to create a logo and menus. Others wanted to know if there was a way to donate money. One comment caught my eye. "Set up a crowdfunding page. I'll donate $50 right now to see those vinyl booths shine again." I spent that day in a daze, alternating between answering comments and returning to the cafe to take more detailed videos of what needed work. Each new post gained traction faster than the last. By evening, I'd set up a crowdfunding page with a modest goal of $10,000, thinking it was ambitious but possible. We hit that within 6 hours. The next week passed in a blur. Money kept coming in, sometimes in $5 and $10 increments, occasionally in shocking amounts of $500 or even $1,000 from anonymous donors who said things like, "My dad owned a diner just like this," or "Wish someone had saved my grandma's restaurant." I documented everything on TikTok, treating my rapidly growing audience as investors who deserve complete transparency. Each small victory became content. Finding a specialist who could repair the jukebox, discovering that the original waffle iron still worked, uncovering a stash of pristine paper menus from 1968 in a storage closet. The most popular video by far was the one where I got the jukebox fully functioning. I filmed myself sliding a quarter into the slot, the mechanical arm selecting a record, and the needle dropping. When Elvis Presley's voice filled the cafe singing Jailhouse Rock, the comments exploded. People loved seeing the authentic 45 spinning, the colored lights glowing again. That video alone brought in another $3,000 in donations. Margaret became an unexpected social media star. Her encyclopedic knowledge of the cafe's history and her no-nonsense delivery made her segments the ones people quoted most. When she demonstrated how to make their famous blue plate special meatloaf in the newly restored kitchen, wearing an apron that said "Kiss the Cook" in faded letters, the internet collectively adopted her as their honorary grandmother. With each passing day, the transformation became more visible. New red vinyl recovered the booth seats. The chrome counters gleamed under fresh lighting. The checkered floor emerged from beneath years of grime, black and white squares playing checkers across the space. 3 weeks in, a reporter from the local paper came by, fascinated by the story of an unemployed teenager and an elderly woman bringing a piece of local history back to life. The article caught the attention of a regional TV station, who sent a crew for a segment on their evening news. Suddenly, Rosie's wasn't just an internet curiosity. It was becoming a local point of pride. People drove by slowly, watching the progress through windows that grew clearer by the day. Some stopped to share memories of birthdays celebrated there decades ago, or first dates at that corner booth, or Saturday morning breakfast after Little League games. Each story added another layer to my understanding of what this place had meant to the community. It wasn't just a cafe. It was where life had happened for generations of local families. Each booth had witnessed first kisses, marriage proposals, retirement celebrations, homework sessions, and countless everyday moments that added up to a community's shared history. Margaret told me that walls remember music and laughter, while people only remember what they choose to. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I started spending nights in the cafe, sometimes working until dawn, surrounded by the quiet energy of the place. In those silent hours, I swear I could feel the memories soaked into the walls. Not in some ghostly way, but in the sense that joy and connection leave a residue that never fully fades. The booths where families had shared countless meals, the counter where regulars had perched every morning for their coffee, the corner where the Christmas tree had stood for 40 years. They all held echoes of what this place had been. And beneath the layers of dust and neglect was something rare and valuable: authenticity. Nothing in Rosie's was faux vintage or artificially distressed. Everything was genuinely from another era, with the honest wear of real use and the patina that only time can create. As the physical restoration progressed, I became increasingly focused on what made Rosie special beyond its appearance. Margaret's recipe boxes became my nighttime study material. I learned about putting a pinch of salt in coffee grounds to cut bitterness, about the secret to their famous pancakes, letting the batter rest overnight, about how Earl had insisted on hand-cutting their hash browns rather than using the frozen stuff. These weren't just recipes. They were philosophy about food and hospitality. Quality ingredients, prepared with care, served with genuine warmth. No cutting corners, no microwaves, no pre-made shortcuts. In my final video before our grand reopening, I stood behind the fully restored counter, everything gleaming and ready behind me. I gained over 100,000 followers by then, people who had traveled this journey with me through their screens. Looking directly into the camera, I made a promise. I'm restoring Rosie's not for the money, but to bring back the kindness that lived here. This place will be about more than good food. It'll be about making people feel they belong somewhere. The simple sincerity of that statement resonated more than all the progress videos combined. It wasn't about nostalgia or aesthetics or even food. It was about creating a space where the best parts of the past could live again in the present. A place where kindness was still the main ingredient in everything we served. 5 months can change everything. 153 days of sawdust in my hair, pain under my fingernails, and an education you can't get in any classroom. That's how long it took to transform Rosie's from a dusty memory into a living, breathing business again. Opening day arrived with a kind of perfect spring morning that feels like the universe is giving you a thumbs up. Sunlight streamed to the freshly cleaned windows, casting golden rectangles across the checkered floor. The chrome fixtures gleamed like they were brand new, and the red vinyl boots practically glowed against the cream-colored walls. I'd been up since 3 a.m., too nervous to sleep, preparing what would become our signature item, memory waffles, made from a recipe I found in Earl's handwritten notebook. The instructions were specific but oddly poetic. Crisp on the outside, soft in the center, like childhood on a plate. It had taken dozens of attempts to get them right, with Margaret tasting each version and shaking her head until one day she took a bite, closed her eyes, and whispered, "That's it. That's Earl's waffle." The secret turned out to be separating the eggs, whipping the whites until they formed stiff peaks, then gently folding them back into the batter. That, and a splash of real vanilla extract that cost more than I wanted to admit. No shortcuts, no box mixes, just honest ingredients and careful technique. Exactly as Earl had done it. As the clock ticked toward our 7 a.m. opening, Margaret arrived wearing a vintage dress she'd saved for special occasions and a smile that made her look decades younger. She carried a small box containing the original bell that had hung on Rosie's door since 1963. The installation of that bell, was our final act of preparation. Margaret held it reverently while I secured it above the door, its brass surface polished to a warm glow. When I finished, she reached up and gave a gentle tap, sending a clear, bright note to the cafe that seemed to say, "Wake up. It's time to begin again." At precisely 7 a.m., I unlocked the door and flipped the sign from closed to open for the first time in over a decade. The butterflies in my stomach felt more like eagles at this point, but there was no turning back now. I'd expected a slow start. Maybe a trickle of curious locals wanted to see what all the online fuss was about. What I hadn't expected was a line already stretching down the block. People who had been waiting since dawn for a chance to be part of Rosie's resurrection. The first customers through the door were a couple in their 80s, Harold and Betty Thompson, as they introduced themselves. Harold Walker came, but insisted on sitting at the counter rather than a booth, because that's where I always Saturday. Betty explained that they'd had their first date at Rosie's in 1957, the year it opened. The look on their faces as they took in a restored cafe was worth every blister, every late night, every moment of doubt I'd experienced over the past 5 months. Harold ran his hand along the counter with the reverence of someone touching a sacred object. That first morning became a parade of stories. The Thompsons were just the beginning. It seemed like every customer who walked through the door carried a piece of Rosie's history with them. An elderly man in a Korean War veteran's cap pointed to the corner booth and announced to everyone within earshot that he proposed his late wife in that exact spot in 1973. His eyes misted over as he told how nervous he'd been, how he'd dropped the ring in her coffee by accident, how she'd fished it out and said yes anyway. A woman in her 60s brought in her high school yearbook to show me a photo of her, and her friends crowded into a booth, drinking milkshakes after graduation. "We came here every Friday night for 4 years," she explained. "This place was our whole social life." A retired teacher reminded me that Rosie's used to give free hot chocolate to kids who brought in report cards with all A's. "Motivated more students than any lecture I ever gave," he chuckled. I found myself scrambling for a way to preserve these stories. On impulse, I started handing out paper napkins, asking people to write down their Rosie's memories. By the end of that first day, I had a collection of handwritten notes that captured decades of community history. The next morning, I came in early and created a memory wall near the entrance, carefully attaching each napkin with colorful pushpins. It quickly became the most photographed corner of the cafe, with new contributions added daily. People would stand there reading, pointing, sometimes tearing up when they recognized a name or an event from their own past. Margaret was in her element, moving from table to table like the queen of a small domain. She remembered regular customers from years ago, asking about children who were now adults with children of their own. For many of the older patrons, seeing her again was as meaningful as seeing the cafe restored. One afternoon during our second week, I found her in the kitchen, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. When I asked what was wrong, she shook her head and said these were happy tears. Seeing the cafe full of life again was like having a piece of Earl returned to her. She told me it was the best memorial she could have given him. Not a stone in a cemetery, but a living, breathing place where his spirit remained in every detail, from the waffle recipe to the way the morning light hit the counter at precisely 8:17 a.m. Margaret became more than just a former owner. She was a keeper of Rosie's traditions, teaching me the recipes that had made the cafe famous in its heyday. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis but still surprisingly deft, showed me how to make the perfect pancakes, let the batter rest overnight. The legendary apple pie, slice the apples paper thin and layer them precisely. And the secret to their hash browns, squeeze every drop of moisture out before frying. These weren't just cooking lessons. They were the transmission of legacy, passed from one generation to the next. About a month after opening, Margaret asked me to meet her at the cafe after closing. She arrived with her attorney, a serious-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses who carried a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. My stomach dropped, assuming something had gone wrong. Perhaps she'd changed her mind about our arrangement. Instead, she slid a thick legal document across the table. The deed to the building and business, transferred fully into my name. When I protested that this wasn't our agreement, that I couldn't possibly accept such a gift, her response was characteristically direct. She feared that if something happened to her, Her estranged sons would swoop in and sell the place to the highest bidder. This way, Rosie's future was secured. The only conditions: I could never sell the property for commercial development, and the cafe must remain Rosie's in perpetuity. I signed the papers with hands that trembled slightly, the weight of the responsibility settling on my shoulders like a mantle I wasn't sure I was ready to wear. 6 weeks into our reopening, something unexpected happened. A woman in designer sunglasses and a cashmere sweater came in alone during our mid-afternoon lull. Nothing about her screamed food blogger, but as she ate her memory waffle, I noticed her discreetly taking photos with a phone that cost more than my monthly revenue. Her name was Vanessa Miller, though I didn't know that yet. What I did know was that she ate with the focused attention of someone who tastes professionally. Small bites, thoughtful pauses, subtle nods. When she asked if she could see the kitchen, I gave her the tour, apologizing for how small and outdated everything was compared to modern restaurants. She smiled at that, saying vintage was exactly the point. Before leaving, she asked if she could take a picture of me behind the counter. I agreed, thinking nothing of it. 2 days later, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Vanessa, it turned out, was a food influencer with over 1 million followers across platforms. Her Instagram story about Rosie's had gone viral overnight. The photos, golden waffles with melting butter, the gleaming jukebox, me looking awkwardly proud behind the counter, were accompanied by a caption that caught fire. This place smells not just of waffles, but the home America has lost. A teenage owner has created something we're all hungry for, not just food, but connection to a time when things made sense. Worth the 3-hour drive, worth any drive. By noon, we had a line out the door and down the block. By evening, we'd run out of everything except coffee, and I was frantically calling suppliers for emergency deliveries. The following week brought a crew from Channel 5, the regional news station. They did a 5-minute segment called Person of the Week, the teen who restored America's soul one waffle at a time. The piece was simultaneously embarrassing and wonderful. Lots of slow-motion shots of butter melting on waffles, customers closing their eyes in bliss as they took their first bites, and me looking overwhelmed but determined in my vintage-style apron. The reporter, a woman with perfect hair who somehow managed to eat on camera without smudging her lipstick, ended the segment with a line that would follow me for years. In a world obsessed with the new, Jacob Taylor reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is preserving what matters from the past. After that, the crowds became unmanageable. The line stretched all the way to Highway on weekends. We started opening an hour earlier and closing 2 hours later, but it was never enough. I hired 3 local high school students, then 5, then 8. Margaret trained them all with the same exacting standards she'd once applied to her own staff. Amid the chaos of success, I tried to maintain what made Rosie special. We still learned customers' names. We still refused to cut corners on ingredients. We still played those original 45s on the jukebox, though now we had to replace the needle monthly from constant use. One particularly busy Saturday, an elderly man lingered at the counter after paying his bill. He'd been watching controlled chaos of the cafe with a businessman's calculating eye. As I wiped down the counter, he introduced himself as the owner of a restaurant development group. "You got lightning in a bottle here, son," he said, sliding a business card toward me. "I'd like to discuss expansion opportunities, multiple locations, franchise potential. We could have a Rosie's in every major city in the Midwest within 5 years." I must have looked startled because he quickly added that authenticity would be the selling point. They'd recreate everything exactly, from the jukebox to the vinyl booths. "People are hungry for nostalgia," he explained. "You've proven the concept works. Now it's time to scale." The offer was serious. The numbers he mentioned casually, projected revenues, growth potential, my potential net worth, made my head spin. More money than I could have imagined 6 months ago, when I was sleeping in a motel room and counting quarters for the laundromat. That night after closing, I sat alone in the cafe, listening to the gentle tick of the vintage wall clock and turning the business card over my hands. The jukebox was silent, the grill cold. In the quiet, I could almost hear the echoes of laughter and conversation from the day's customers. I thought about what scaling would mean. Designers creating authentic-looking booths that have been artificially distressed to appear vintage. Corporate kitchens trying to recreate our waffles according to a standardized recipe. Employees trained to deliver a consistent nostalgic experience rather than forming genuine connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. I restored Rosie's because it offered something real in a world of cheap imitations. And now I was being asked to create cheap imitations of Rosie's. When a local reporter asked me the next day about rumors of expansion, I found myself half laughing. The waffles have already burned through my paycheck. I told her, I'm just wondering if the soul of this place could survive in multiple locations. That's the real challenge. The quote ran in the Sunday paper, but it wasn't the rejection the businessman might have expected. That night, his business card sat on my table while I sketched ideas in a notebook. What if each Rosie's could be unique to its community? What if instead of carbon copies, there were variations on a theme, each with its own local stories and character? I called Margaret to discuss it. Her initial resistance softened when I explained my vision, not a soulless chain, but a collection of authentic spaces, each honoring its location's history, while sharing the core values that made the original special. Earl would say that good ideas deserve to grow, she finally conceded. But he'd also say that growth without roots just creates weeds. The next morning, I called the businessman back. I'm interested, I said, but on one condition. Each location has to have its own soul. No corporate cookie cutters. He seemed intrigued rather than deterred. I hung up feeling both terrified and excited. Could I really preserve what made Rosie's magical while letting it expand? Or would success be the thing that finally killed its spirit? As I flipped the sign to open that morning, I felt both excited and nervous. Could expanding Rosie's be the opportunity of a lifetime, or the mistake that would destroy everything special we'd built? Only time would tell. Success has a way of bringing people out of woodwork. 3 months after that Channel 5 segment aired, I looked up from the counter to see my mother standing awkwardly by the door, fidgeting with her purse strap, looking both out of place and oddly familiar. I barely recognized her at first. She dyed her hair back to its natural color and lost the hardness around her eyes that had become her permanent expression during those final months in the trailer. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across the bustling cafe. She finally approached the counter, her eyes darting nervously around the place, and said she'd seen me on TV, claimed she'd always known I was special, that I was destined for bigger things in that trailer park. The words rang hollow against the memory of her empty bedroom, and that hastily scribbled note on the refrigerator. I thanked her for coming by, offered her a complimentary coffee, and went back to work. There wasn't much else to say. She sat in a corner booth for nearly an hour, watching me interact with customers, before quietly leaving without a proper goodbye, a fitting symmetry to how she left the first time. A week later, Aunt Deb showed up during the lunch rush, wearing makeup I'd never seen before and an outfit clearly purchased for the occasion. Unlike my mother, she didn't bother with pretense. She got straight to the point. She wanted in on the business. Reminded me that she'd raised me, that families should stick together when opportunities arise. I found myself unexpectedly calm as I refilled coffee mugs and listened to her proposal. 6 months earlier, I might have erupted in anger or shrunk in intimidation. But something had changed in me during those months of rebuilding Rosie's, not just the cafe but myself in the process. When she finished her pitch, I looked her directly in the eyes for perhaps the first time in my life and told her, simply and without malice, that my family wasn't defined by blood or legal obligation. My family was everyone who walked through those doors, who left $2 for coffee and 5 minutes of their memories. The people who helped build this place with their stories and their support when I had nothing. The look of shock on her face almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. She left without finishing her waffle, the bell above the door jingling with finality as she exited my life for what I suspected would be the last time. That evening, I hung a small American flag by the entrance, not out of some grand patriotic gesture, but as a quiet nod to Margaret's canvas bags and Earl's belief that in America, everyone deserves a second chance at building something meaningful. The flag reminded me daily that Rosie's wasn't just a business. It was a promise kept to a woman who had believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. 2 years flew by in a blur of 18-hour days, constant challenges, and the kind of exhaustion that somehow feels worthwhile. Margaret became the grandmother I'd lost too early, teaching me not just about business, but about life. We celebrated her 80th birthday in the cafe with a surprise party that brought tears to her usually stoic face. The expansion happened gradually and thoughtfully. The second Rosie's opened in a struggling downtown area 2 hours away, another forgotten gem from the 60s that had stood empty for years. I spent weeks learning about that town's history, incorporating local stories and flavors into the menu, while keeping the core of what made the original special. The third location came a year later, in a college town where students embrace the analog experience of a place without Wi-Fi, where conversation and actual face-to-face interaction were the main attractions beside the food. Each new Rosie's maintained its own personality. The booths might all be red vinyl. The floors might all be checkered, but the memory walls were unique to each community. The small details mattered. The selection on the jukeboxes reflected each town's musical heritage. The specials incorporated local ingredients. The walls displayed photographs from that specific community's past. As the business grew, I made sure our values grew with it. We instituted a policy of hiring at least 30% of staff from disadvantaged backgrounds, veterans struggling to find civilian work, people in recovery programs, teenagers aging out of foster care, people who, like me, just needed someone to give them a chance. A portion of each month's profits went to local charities, homeless shelters, veterans organizations, programs for at-risk youth, not because it made for good PR, though it did, but because success feels empty if it's not shared. Margaret's philosophy of generosity became woven into Rosie's DNA as surely as Earl's waffle recipe. Financial security didn't change my daily routine much. I still opened the original Rosie's most mornings, still remembered regular customers' orders, still personally trained every new hire on the importance of authentic connections over quick transactions. Money was nice, but it wasn't the point. I'd learned early that wealth has little to do with dollars. 5 years after that rainy night when my aunt threw my photos in the trash, I found myself sitting in the original Rosie's after closing, listening to Buddy Holly on the jukebox, and taking stock of how completely my life had transformed. From homeless teenager to successful business owner. From unwanted burden to employer of dozens. From someone desperate for family to someone who had created a family of choice that expanded daily. On the wall by the entrance, written in chalk in Margaret's elegant handwriting, were the words, "Memory Cafe, where every guest becomes family." Outside, cars rush by on their way to somewhere important. Inside, time slowed down just enough to remember what matters. People often ask if I'm proud of what I built. The question always feels slightly off target. Pride implies I did this alone, that Rosie's success belongs to me. The truth is more complicated and more beautiful. These cafes, aren't monuments to my vision or hard work. They're living testaments to the power of shared stories, second chances, and the simple truth that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in how many lives you've warmed with your presence. We all search for meaning in different ways. Some climb corporate ladders, some raise families, some create art that outlasts them. I found mine in an unexpected place, preserving a piece of America's soul one waffle at a time, creating spaces where strangers can become family over a cup of coffee and a shared moment of connection. And that, perhaps, is the most American success story of all, not the rags to riches tale, but the journey from isolation to community, from being forgotten to creating something unforgettable. The trailer park kid with nowhere to go build a place where everyone belongs, and in doing so, finally found home,